Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. Hope you're all in tip-top form. And today I'm going to be showing you some of the CDs I've been listening to recently. I picked these at random from my CD collection, and some of these I've not listened to for quite a few years. First up we've got David Bowie and 1966. And this was put out on the Sanctuary label in a nice little digipack. I'm fascinated by David Bowie's 1960s material. He wasn't fully formed yet as an artist, but it's fascinating to hear his take on the musical trends of the time. 1966 saw him signing to Pi Records, and he released 3 singles during the year, and the A's and B-sides are gathered together on this little CD mini album. Even at this stage, he was writing all of his own material. And what you get here is mod-influenced R&B, lifted by his strong vocals and also the English-centric lyrics that he was writing at the time. Can't Help Thinking About Me should have been a hit at the time, I think. It's a really strong track. And next up, it's Paul Revere and the Raiders and Greatest Hits. And this was put out by CBS. They're a group that didn't mean a lot in the UK in the 1960s, but through various garage band covers of their songs, which I've heard over the years, including by the Flaming Groovies, it brought them to my attention. What strikes me is how raucous they could be on tracks such as Stepping Out, Kicks, Just Like Me. Their original version of Ups and Downs actually outclasses the version by the Flaming Groovies, and they're one of my favourite bands of all time. There are a couple of not so good tracks on here. Melody of an Unknown Girl and Legend of Paul Revere are pretty lacklustre, even cringeworthy. But the rest of the album is full of Anglophile beat group perfection. And next it's the Dillards and 2 albums on 1 CD, Beck, Porch, Bluegrass and Live Almost. It comes in a digipack. My love of Gene Clark brought me to the Dillards via the 2 Dillard and Clark albums from the late 60s. Doug Dillard was a pretty extraordinary banjo player, and he'd formed the Dillards in the early 60s with his brother Rodney. Back Porch Bluegrass is their debut album from 1963. It's a winning mix of mind-boggling instrumental dexterity, new arrangements of traditional songs, and a few originals as well. Live Almost mines a similar seam, but it's spoilt for me by some embarrassing so-called comedic introductions to many of the songs, which play upon hillbilly stereotypes of the time, and they certainly spoil the flow of the CD. Moving on, it's a self-titled album by Doris Troy, which was put out on the Apple label. She was originally from Harlem, New York, and she signed to Atlantic Records. Troy moved to the UK in 1965 when one of her singles broke through here. And she also wrote the track Just One Look, which became a major hit around the world for the Hollies. She became an in-demand backing vocalist, and it was while singing backing vocals on a Billy Preston session that she was brought to the attention of George Harrison. And it turns out that George Harrison was a big fan of her material for Atlantic, and even had her 1 album that she recorded there, and I think nearly all of the singles as well. So he decided then to sign her to Apple and work with them. The influence of the Beatles is all over this album. There are 2 Harrison Troy songs, and there's another 2 songs where credits are also given to Ringo Starr and Stephen Stills. Harrison and Starr play on the album, and also Beatles associates such as Billy Preston and also Klaus Voormann. Her vocals are really strong and soulful, none more so than on the gospel-drenched traditional song Jacob's Ladder, which I think is the highlight. Unfortunately, you get a bit of a muddy sound at times, which is typical, I think, of quite a lot of the early Apple releases. The next CD I picked out of my collection was the Yum Yums and Singles and Stuff, and this was put out on the Screaming Apple label. They're a Norwegian, if you don't know, Norwegian pop punkers, power poppers. They're still going strong today. This is a 2001 CD compilation which brings together various singles and comp appearances. There's also a couple of unreleased tracks, and it's essential, I think, for fans of guitar power pop. All of the tracks are fun and energetic, whether they be originals by Mort Henriksen or some choice covers of tracks such as Chewy Chewy, Wigwam Bam, and the Barracudas' I Can't Pretend. And the liner notes by Henriksen give added context to the songs as well. Next up, it's John Howard and Kid in a Big World, and this came out on the RPM label. This was a real event CD reissue for me when it came out back in the early 2000s. I'm a sucker for fey English middle-class singer-songwriters, and John Howard is one of the best. The single Goodbye Susie was on a par with mid-70s Elton John, and should have been a hit at the time, but sadly never graced the charts. Maybe at that time the tide was starting to turn against sort of left field melancholy, piano-based quirkiness that he exemplified here. Rod Argent's synthesizer and mellotron gives it an added period charm, as do the tasteful brass and string arrangements as well. And moving on, we come to an album credited to Jeff Beck, and it's Shapes of Things, 60s Groups and Sessions, and this was put out on the Sanctuary label. On paper it sounds like a good idea, but there are too many obvious tracks on here by the Yardbirds and Jeff Beck solo, which are available elsewhere. And also, two of the tracks by the Night Shift are included based on unsubstantiated rumours that he actually played as a session guitarist. And the same rumours apply to two tracks by Screaming Lord Sutch, two by the Fits and Starts, and one by The Smoke. And the album ends with three really mediocre tracks by LA groupies, the GTOs. So overall, it's a very hit and miss affair, this CD. And next we've got Shakin with the Devil, The Best of the Pirates, 1977-1979. And this was a nice package put together by the Salvo label. And Mick Green, Johnny Spence and Frank Farley were, between 1962 and 1964, the Pirates backing Johnny Kidd. And they were an R&B power trio. Mick Green's simultaneous rhythm and lead guitar style was a big influence at the time on Pete Townsend of The Who, Jimmy Page, and in the 1970s, Dr. Feelgood as well. They decided to return to the London club circuit in 1976 and were an instant sensation. They were arguably the most incendiary live act in the clubs at that time. And their first album, Out of Their Skulls, is a mix of live and studio tracks and is absolutely flawless. The energy does start to dissipate slightly, I think, on the second and third albums, which are included here. But the CD also has a number of live tracks which are pretty amazing, or just leave you slack-jawed in amazement when you hear them. Next up, it's Bangs and Tiger Beat on Kill Rock Stars, and this is Bang's debut from 1998 on the Riot Girl label, and they were classed as a Riot Girl act, but they very much had pop sensibilities at their heart as well, and their power pop tendencies really became far more obvious on the second album, Sweet Revenge, which included a really faultless cover of Southern Girls by Cheap Trick. I saw them live in a small club in 2001, and they really impressed me with the beautiful simplicity of the songs and the vivacity of their performance as well. And next up, it's a 2 CD set which was put out by Detour of Long Tall Shorty's recordings from the late 70s, early 80s, and called Completely Perfect. Long Tall Shorty were one of the best mod revival bands from the late 70s period. They played with a real punk energy, and that helped attract Jimmy Percy and Charlie Harper as producers. Unfortunately, various lineup changes and also being dropped by the major label that they were initially signed to really adversely affected their career. But they did leave behind some great tracks. Win or Lose and 1970s Boy are classics for me, and you also get the first release of the sessions that would have made up their debut album. And next up, it's Originals by Prince on the Warner Brothers label. This was a posthumous release, which makes you marvel at how prolific Prince actually was. All of these were demos of songs that he eventually gave away to other artists. He had a smorgasbord of instruments at his disposal, and he also plays around with his vocals on some of these as well, which is interesting. On You're My Love, for example, he deepens his voice, and it's interesting to compare his version with the version by Kenny Rogers that was eventually released. And next we've got a self-titled album by the Orgone Box, and this was put out on the -0 label. The Orgone Box is basically a Rick Corcoran who just plays a psych-tinged pop which manages to plant earworms in your brain. He hasn't been prolific over the years, but everything that he releases is worth a listen. And these were recordings from 1995, but they were eventually put out by -0 in 2001. It includes a reworking of his minor hit Judy Over the Rainbow, which he'd recorded with the band Orange, who were briefly signed to the Chrysalis label. Tracks like Hello Central, Give Me Ganymede and World Revolves have a similar feel, I think, to the Soft Boys, with wonderful chiming guitars. And next it's From Genesis to Revelation by Genesis on the Edsel label, and this is more fey English middle class vocals, in this case by Peter Gabriel, of course. And what makes this a really worthwhile purchase is that you get a reissue of the first album, but also a second CD of singles and unreleased tracks as well. And some of the demos on here date back to 1967. The mainly acoustic instrumentation and at times almost choir boy-like vocals of Peter Gabriel, and also touches of strings give this a very English pastoral feel. And the track A Place to Call My Own springs to mind as one of those tracks. And next up it's Home Sweet Home by Terry Manning, and this was put out on the Sunbeam label. As a big fan of Big Star, this was an essential purchase for me. These recordings were the first by Chris Bell, and his guitar can be heard on Guess Things Happen That Way, Trashy Dog, Wild Wild Rocker, and One After 909. Apart from that, though, it's a pretty slim pickings. I think when the opening track is a self-indulgent 10-minute plus version of Savoy Truffle, I think you know you're in for a really tough ride. There are only 3 original songs on this album. The sleeve notes do include some interesting comments by Terry Manning, though. Next up, it's a Stone Cold classic, and it's Michael Chapman and Fully Qualified Survivor. It originally came out on the EMI Harvest label in 1970 and was Michael Chapman's second album. The album producer Gus Dudgeon has described Michael Chapman as an acoustic rock and roller. His musical interests encompassed folk, rock, blues, unusual guitar tunings, and all of this can be heard on this album. And you also get on the electric guitar a very young Mick Ronson. The most famous song on here is Postcards of Scarborough. Its intriguing lyrics suggesting world weariness. Not everybody is a fan of Paul Buckmaster's string arrangements, but I think they do enhance the melancholy feel of this track in particular. Soulful Lady and Kodak Ghosts were favourites of Michael Chapman's, and he said of Soulful Lady, it goes like shit off a shovel. I could imagine Peter Green era Fleetwood Mac doing a show-stopping version of this track. Okay, that's it for now. I'd love to hear your comments on the CDs I've been listening to. Also, let me know what you've been listening to, because I'm really interested to hear what other people like and enjoy. And also consider subscribing if you haven't done already. And I will be back again soon with another video, so look out for that. Okay, take care, everybody.